America today than we were when President Trump took office after President Biden had failed to deter Vladimir Putin.
Mr. Secretary, it's great to see you. Worth pointing out that Helsinki, you were in a different weight class. I know that very well. But it is worth pointing out, too, that you know, Putin is a tough negotiator. And we talk about how he's former KGB, how he's kind of wily. Talk about that, Putin behind the scenes, and maybe what President Trump is dealing with at this hour.
Well, Brett, first of all, thanks for that footnote there. Look, it's absolutely true that he is clever. He is engaging. Just like President Trump, Putin can be charming. We all remember President Bush saying he saw Putin's soul when he looked into his eyes. This is a disarming character. But Brett, the other thing that I don't think President Trump will lose sight of is also a deeply immoral human being. The fact that there are thousands of Russians casualties every month doesn't really faze him. You and I, Martha, President Trump, when we lose an American soldier and go to Dover Air Force Base, right, this is something that hurts our soul. This doesn't bother Vladimir Putin one iota. He has a mission. It's the restoration of the Soviet Union. He doesn't just want Ukraine. He would love to go further. I think he knows now he can't get that with President Trump in office, and now he's got to make this strategic calculation about where the right exit point is for him and for his people, given that he probably has achieved his maximalist objective today.
You know, how tough, I guess, is the question, do you expect President Trump to be on Putin? I mean, President Trump has the upper hand. Putin's economy is in really bad shape right now, and as we've said many times, he's losing 30,000 people. I know you just said he doesn't really care. He's going to run out of people eventually to send to the front lines. They're already paying them more than your average person gets in Russia. So how much of a hard line do you expect President Trump to take, and what will he make him bend on, potentially?
Martha, I just think history ought to suggest exactly how tough Donald Trump will be on Vladimir Putin. I saw the videos that you showed from the opening nights. None of us should forget that the very missiles that saved Kyiv, that saved Ukraine that night, were delivered to him in the Trump's first administration by our team, not by President Obama and not by President Biden. Donald Trump has always been tough on Vladimir Putin. The fact that we're drilling here in the United States, lowering energy prices, puts real pressure on the Russian economy, exactly as you described. And while he doesn't care about those lives, he does care about, does he have enough of them to actually prosecute the war in a continued way. President Trump will make clear to Vladimir Putin, not what he just said in a press conference, but he'll make very clear to him directly, there are increased costs, increased burdens on you if you continue this. If you give us a ceasefire, if you provide that outcome, good things can happen, better things can happen for you. I think President Trump will be unambiguous about that. I hope that pressure today will be enough. If it's not, more pressure, better outcome down the line.
Mr. Secretary, if you were the Secretary of State in that position today, what would you be telling President Trump?
Goodness, in the room, I'd probably be giving him very little advice. I think he's been fully prepared for today. In the run-up to this, I would have made clear to him that we have lots of tools in our kit bag. Certainly tariffs and sanctions, we've talked about those. Certainly secondary sanctions on those buying energy. We've already got the Europeans building their defensive capabilities. I would be telling President Trump, let's be ready. If Putin doesn't give us what we want today, let's be ready to tomorrow ratchet up in a very public way these penalties, these burdens on him, so that he recognizes that his failure to give us what we wanted today this was his best day to have done it. If he makes that mistake, the costs will only get greater.
But Secretary Pompeo, you heard Brett say earlier that they are walking in there, Secretary of State Rubio and other cabinet members with maps. We've heard President Trump talk about a potential land swap. The land that Russia's already taken, we know they want more than that in that eastern area that would push them a little bit further to the west. What do you think is on these maps? What do you think is on the table in terms of this land swap?
Martha, I suspect they'll probably pull the maps out at some point today. But I do think President Trump's made pretty clear that's not really his to give. That's for Zelensky to negotiate with Putin. I think what they're going to try to feel out is, where is it that Putin would really land? What would be good enough? Look, as a practitioner, I get it. To physically retake this land in the near term for Ukraine is going to be a really difficult task. But the absence of recognition of that as Russian sovereign territory will be important. Confident that'll be part of the, I'll call it a map or geography discussion. But in the end, this will be an economic discussion as well. Putin's economy is struggling. He needs to be with the West. The Chinese Communist Party's economy isn't going to be what sustains him. Putin knows he needs to return that, and the only one that can unlock that, the Western economy, the only one that can unlock that for him is President Trump.
Mr. Secretary, we appreciate the time. Stand by if you would. Martha?
Thank you, Brett. Thank you.
Let's bring in now former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, retired four-star General Philip Breedlove, understands a lot about the military presence of NATO. General, good to have you back on the program today. We just spoke yesterday. Your thoughts as you watched this greeting between the Russian leader and President Trump today on the tarmac, and now they're behind closed doors.
Well, thanks again for being on, Martha. I think the world has to want this to succeed. It doesn't matter which side of the aisle you're on, left or right. We all want an end to this Russian aggression in Ukraine. And so we have a chance now. And I think the president enters this in the right frame of mind. And he has a distinct objective to get a ceasefire. And he has said that if there's no ceasefire, then there's no second meeting. So we're hopeful that he can get that ceasefire today, and then we can begin more productive talks in the future.
General, it's great to see you. Brett Baer here. You know, as former NATO Supreme Commander, talk about Vladimir Putin's fear, if you will, of NATO and the real threat that he sees in Ukraine possibly getting NATO membership, even though that seems very far-reaching now.
Well, Mr. Putin has always had this fear. He likes to try to blame this fear on expansionism. And in fact, Mr. Putin is responsible for most of the expansion of NATO. Most recently, Sweden and Finland joining NATO because of Mr. Putin's repeated invasions of his neighbors. And so he understands, especially now, Ukraine has really tore up the Russian army. Remember, they have asked 20,000 North Koreans to help them retake Russian land in Kursk, and even with the North Koreans, they've been unable to take that land. And even now, while they're trying to project that they're winning in this offensive, the fact remains that in the last 14 months, Russia has lost over 400,000 soldiers, and they've taken less than 1% of Ukraine. So Mr. Putin is not in a good place. He wants the world to believe he's in a good place, but he's not.
So one of the things that has been discussed as something that could be on the table if President Trump doesn't get what he wants, or if he wants to apply more pressure to Putin, is to remove the restrictions on how U.S. weapons that are now going to be purchased solely by NATO members can be used against Putin and against Russia. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I believe this policy is long overdue being redone. We have built sanctuary for Russia. They have attacked hundreds of thousands of times into Ukraine from all around Ukraine, but we have forbid Ukraine from firing Western weapons back. And I think that it's time to take that restriction off, remove the sanctuary that we have built for Russia, and I think that will bring that pressure on Mr. Putin.
And is the pressure also, the president, as I talked to him on Air Force One today, is still very proud of the effort to get NATO countries to 5% of their GDP on defense spending. He said they weren't paying the 2.5, now they're paying 5% of their GDP. And by doing that, they increase their defense spending and, I guess, increase the pressure on Vladimir Putin.
Exactly, Brett. And the word paying is not exactly right. It's about investing in their own militaries. It's Article 3 of the Atlantic Charter, as opposed to Article 5 that everybody talks about. But you have it exactly right. NATO is responding. 4 times since 2008, Russia has amassed its army, marched across internationally recognized borders, and invaded a neighbor. And so NATO now understands that Mr. Putin is not interested in peace, and they're beginning to prepare. And Mr. Putin has himself to blame for that. Our president has done a good job of waking up and getting the program rolling, but we also have to thank Mr. Putin's intransigence for being a big part of waking up NATO.
So if there is, we all hope, as you said at the outset, that there's a ceasefire and that this killing stops. We have not seen this kind of killing in Europe since World War I. The trench warfare that we've seen in this has been devastating. So, I guess my question is, what are these NATO nations willing to do exactly if there isn't a ceasefire? We know that they want to buy weapons, but we just heard that Keir Starmer doesn't necessarily want to put any boots on the ground in this situation. It's a broad question, but as NATO Supreme Commander, what do you think?
So, we actually have the United Kingdom in the last couple of days offer that they might put boots on the ground in a peacekeeping arrangement, peace enforcement. So I think the things that have to happen right off the bat is if we do not get a ceasefire today, then the president should today, in the very same newscast, put the hammer down on the sanctions. And then if we get Mr. Putin back to the table and get a peace mechanism in place, the United Kingdom has said they will consider putting boots on the ground. And, oh, by the way, our own president has said that he wouldn't take off the table the United States being a part of those peace mechanisms. And so we're beginning to see the formation of how a peace would be kept. And that's where we want to be. We want to get a ceasefire today, period. And then get to the table again, as our president has suggested, with the right people, and then hammer out a peace. Ceasefire long term does not help Ukraine. Peace helps Ukraine.
Well, General, thank you very much for the time and your expertise on a day like this. Very important. We appreciate it.
Thank you, General.
We're now several minutes into the meeting with President Trump and President Putin. Stick with us. Continuing coverage as we await an update from inside.
Like us, you might be suffering from moderate to severe obstructive sleep apnea, or OSA. We are the undiagnosed. We've been told we snore at night and gasp for air. Daytime sleepiness is a drag, but we still have people who count on us. And we're more than just human beings. We are humans being. OSA is a chronic condition tied to breathing interruptions and oxygen deprivation during sleep. You're undiagnosed? That was us. Talk to your doctor about OSA. Let's keep being humans being.
We asked Howie Mandel to describe new hands-free cozy fit Skechers slip-ins.
They're like little soft puff jackets for your feet. These are like cozy little slippers for the street.
Introducing new hands-free cozy fit Skechers slip-ins. Ultra comfortable sneakers you just step into with no bending down or touching.
We handcraft every Stearns & Foster using the finest materials like indulgent memory foam and ultra-conforming inner springs for a beautiful mattress and indescribable comfort. Save up to $800 on select adjustable mattress sets at stearnsandfoster.com.
This school year, know they made it to school and practice and back home with Life 360.
When emergency strikes, first responders rely on the latest technology. That's why T-Mobile created T-Priority, built for the 5G era. Only T-Priority dynamically dedicates more capacity for first responders.
My eyes, they're dry, looking for hydration. Blink NutriTears is a once-daily supplement clinically proven to help your eyes produce more of their own tears for lasting, continuous relief. A different way to support dry eyes.
I'm John Morgan of Morgan & Morgan. Did you know there are over 6,000 car crashes every day across the United States? Injured in a car accident?
Call 800-502-4800. Call now.
there's only one Morgan and Morgan.
Tonight, after the Alaska summit, President Trump sits down with Sean, detailing his meeting with Putin and what it means for the Russia-Ukraine war. The must-see interview, tonight on Hannity.
I'm kind of a deal hunter. I like to make sure we got the best deal.
We used a Spectrum savings calculator before. I learned that since we're existing Spectrum Internet customers, we get a mobile line for a year.
Having a line for a year would be amazing. I looked at you and I said, how is the savings so substantial?
Yeah, with the savings, we could use it to fund some trips for us, I think.
My son is starting to need a regular phone. There's going to be a point where I think communication through the school has to be through their own phone number. So I think that we're going to need more mobile lines.
Seems like a no-brainer. There's no risk, so might as well try it, you know.
Switch and save with one mobile line included with your internet service, backed by the Spectrum commitment to keep you connected.
I'm fighting, and I'm just getting started.
Who's Thomas Massey fighting for? Not the single moms who no longer pay taxes on their tips. Not the police officers who no longer pay taxes on their overtime. Not the seniors who no longer pay taxes on Social Security. President Trump passed those working class tax cuts. But Thomas Massey joined the Democrats and voted no. Let's fire Thomas Massey. MAGA Kentucky is responsible for the content of this advertising.
So what are your expectations? I mean, is the goal of this meeting in Alaska to walk away with a ceasefire?
So when you talk about deals, it's all I do my whole life. I do deals. You never know. You don't like to have too many expectations. You want it because you have to weave and bob, and you don't know what's going to happen. But we're going to go and find out. I'd like to see a ceasefire. I wouldn't be thrilled if I didn't get it, but everyone says you're not going to get the ceasefire. It'll take place on the second meeting. The second meeting is going to be but I'm not going to be happy with that. So we'll see what happens. I'm going to be, I won't be happy if I walk away without some form of a ceasefire. Now, I say this, and I've said it from the beginning, this is really setting the table today. We're going to have another meeting if things work out, which will be very soon. Or we're not going to have any more meetings at all, maybe ever.
President Trump on Air Force One in the office there, Martha, you know, for days, the president and the White House were lowering expectations. Guess what? He has expectations, and he was articulating them there.
Yeah, I think it's also really interesting at the tail end of that, he says, you know, it's today or maybe never. So he's putting the pressure on Putin to not let this moment pass. And we will see. They're talking right now, and we only wish we could be a fly on the wall. Will Kane is here with us, watching all of this unfold. Host, of course, of the Will Kane Show at 4 p.m. Eastern here on Fox News Channel. Will, it's great to have you with us, and I know you're going to be on the 5 tonight as well. But you listen to President Trump stacking that up and saying, you know, if not now, maybe never.
Yeah, I think it's a remarkable line.
Yeah.
Now, is that something President Trump means or something that he's going to hold over the head of Vladimir Putin? Time will tell as they sit in this room together right now. Hopefully it's all going well, but President Trump seemed in his interview with Brett optimistic. He certainly seemed optimistic for the ability to set up a second meeting. And again, I'm taken by these moments. I'm taken by the moments of Vladimir Putin and President Donald Trump meeting there on the tarmac, on the red carpet, right there not far from Brett. And I'd be curious if Brett could confirm this, but there's video going around social media that during this moment, right before they walked to that stage that reads Alaska 2025, we could all see when the planes flew overhead, and both men stopped and looked to the sky. But that was an American B-2 bomber flying right over the head of Vladimir Putin. And I just think so much of this pageantry is part of the negotiation, establishing which one of these men is in charge.
Yeah, you could hear that he heard the noise over his head, right, Brett? And then they both looked up, and we knew that that flyover was coming. I'm not sure if Putin knew that or not, Brett.
Yeah, no, the B-2 bombers did fly over at that moment. They both looked up. And to your point, Will, this is pageantry, this is drama, but it also sends a signal. Remember, B-2 bombers from Whiteman Air Force Base traveled 36 hours and dropped ordnance on Iran nuclear facilities. And that was not too long ago. And it was a message not only for the Middle East, but for the world.
Yeah, incredible moment. All of it incredible. We can only see what comes out if it reflects this display of strength going into the meeting, what we'll get on the back end. And I'm always reminded there's yet another party to this deal, and you've had this incredible wall up, Martha, throughout this program showing what both sides want to end this war. And there's a party that's not present, and that is Zelensky, and that is Ukraine. And so what kind of concessions can be made today, and then what kind of concessions can be made by Zelensky?
Yeah, you have to wonder about one of those lines is regime change in Ukraine.
Saw that.
Essentially, the only way he agrees is if Zelensky's gone. We know he used to have Yanukovych, his own guy, basically, in control there. That fell apart in Ukraine, and then the Ukrainian people decided to elect someone that they wanted to run the country, and that is the environment that Putin has called a Nazi formation in the government in Ukraine. So they have very different views of the future of these two men.
And it's hard to see from this distance, sitting at a table in New York City, how you can thread this needle. But again, President Trump has left himself the flexibility, described himself accurately to Brett as a deal maker. It's a hard deal on the table. Where is the concession? Where is the compromise? But I think that's possibly what we're not hearing as we sit here and talk in some closed room between two of the world's most powerful men.
Oh, we're just seeing the flyover. You can see the B-2 bomber formation over the skies there. Maybe we can rack that and play it one more time because it is impressive. Yeah, Brett, you think about that. President Trump wants to be a peacemaker. He wants to end wars. He makes this clear in almost every conversation, and he said it again to you today. He's looking for places where these two can come together and get this thing done.
Yeah, in fact, he talked about Pakistan and India. He talked about the Congo and Rwanda. He talked about Armenia and Azerbaijan. There you see the B-2s in formation there above their heads as they look up. There are 6 places that essentially he's helped broker peace or make peace deals or ceasefires. He said that there were some of those 6 that were tougher on paper than this one was supposed to be. And I asked him about saying on the campaign trail, you were going to solve this in 24 hours. And he conceded it was much more difficult. And the personalities involved are much more entrenched. And Putin and Zelensky hate each other. But he still, to Will's point, came to this point where he felt optimistic, at least a little bit, with a caveat that he could always walk away.
And I would be curious to ask both of you, here we are, roughly, what are we, an hour into this, since they both got into the beast and headed off into this meeting. There was overhanging this, as both of you have pointed out, Brett, the potential for Donald Trump to walk away. If it's not going to work out, if it's not going well, then he'll walk away from this meeting. I don't know how much optimism we should read into 1 hour. They're still in there together. And I don't know that we should expect it to last the 6 or 7 hours that apparently it's been scheduled. That's a real testament to a marathon negotiation. And it probably doesn't play into the hands of President Trump. That is simply, you would think, would be wanted by Vladimir Putin. But I think we should take some optimism that we're an hour into this deal.
Yeah, you have to wonder if part of the time is the Russian side saying, if this, and this, then we could maybe start to discuss a ceasefire. And one of the things that, the president has appeared to have leaned toward is, ceasefire and then we talk. But the Russians appear to be leaning towards the side of we nail all this down, we start talking about it, and then potentially we have a ceasefire. But, do you feel it's safe to assume that President Trump really wants the ceasefire first and all these talks to come later, based on what he said to you, right?
Yeah, and we went over that a number of times in the interview. We'll air the whole thing, by the way, at Special Report at 6 p.m. Eastern. To follow up, the chief negotiator, is Steve Witkoff, and he has met with Putin. He has met with his counterpart in Russia numerous times, and I talked to him on the plane. He said he talked to him 6 times yesterday, and that there was a real push by the Russians to get to a deal that included a ceasefire. So he was at least signaling a lot of optimism in the setup, and there has to be that setup in order for this to start to begin with. Not to say that it couldn't fall apart, but to Will's point, you know, the clock is ticking and they're still there.
Indeed, it's really been interesting to watch Steve Witkoff's role, as you pointed out earlier, grow and grow in this environment. And I think one of the first times that most of America probably heard of Steve Witkoff was when he was golfing with President Trump, and a second assassination attempt happened, and President Trump wanted to know right away if Steve was okay. And since then, we have heard Steve Witkoff's name, almost on a daily basis from this administration. He's become a very important confidant and part of this.
Racking up win after win after win.
Absolutely.
Again, something that we listened to Brett bring up with President Trump there on Air Force One. Azerbaijan and Armenia, Rwanda and Congo, India and Pakistan. Steve Witkoff integral in all these deals, not to mention, of course, Hamas, Israel, and Iran as well. And so, all due respect to Hillary Clinton, President Trump, with the aid of Steve Witkoff, might have already secured the Nobel Peace Prize, and he might not need the nomination of Hillary Clinton, but this right here, this would, of course, be an incredible, incredible accomplishment for both men, Witkoff and Trump.
Yeah, and that is what we all hope for today, and certainly the people of Russia and Ukraine hope for it, Brett.
Yeah, and you know, we're talking about the Ukrainians, and we're talking to a lot of people who talk to the Ukrainians. I've reached out to them, and they've expressed, and obviously they're watching this in big numbers because they want to see every nuance of this meeting. You know, I talked to President Zelensky numerous times. I went to the front lines and interviewed him on the anniversary of the war. Here's just a clip of one of the last times I talked to him, 2024.
If he was here, like we are, what would you tell him?
But I think his eyes, first of all, his eyes, ears, yes, will tell him what's going on. First of all, why I said, please come. I'm happy to see all the candidates and all the people who are decision makers or can support, not to be against, just to understand what the war in Ukraine means. Who opened this war, who began it, and what's going on.
That's when he was inviting President Trump to come to the front lines, and he was worried that Congress was not going to reauthorize funding to support Ukraine. They eventually did. And, you know, he's been an interesting character, and obviously that Oval Office meeting, went south. It was not a good moment, but since then, President Trump has, you know, rectified that in his conversations. He had an amazing meeting, to his point, as he described it, in Rome, in the Vatican, and has since called very positive conversations since then.
Well, as I mentioned, I think he's the specter hanging over these negotiations. He's the missing player, and I understand that President Trump is setting the table for that second meeting that would include Zelensky. We all saw that day, that moment in the Oval Office. We all saw, by the way, him sit down with you later that night on Special Report, and he was incredibly agitated, incredibly upset. And it's interesting how that relationship with President Trump has evolved over time. I'm not sure I fully comprehend the state of the relationship today, exactly how close or reconciled they have become. But as you pointed out, Martha, on the list of demands for Vladimir Putin is regime change in Ukraine. And I would imagine that is a condition is probably not acceptable to Zelensky. Now, what will he approve of? Will he approve of giving up these lands that have already been taken by Vladimir Putin in Russia? What kind of security does he need on the other side of that land to ensure, as you pointed out, Brett, it's not just a lily pad or a launching point or another violation of a ceasefire, even a peace deal? There's so many questions, but I think what Zelensky will accept is almost harder to answer than what will be accepted by Putin. As you both have laid out, by the way, over the past hour and a half, we can see the pressure on Putin, the economic pressure, perhaps the limitations of his war-making capabilities. It's hard to see right now what you get a yes from Zelensky.
Yeah, just to put a point on that, the destruction in the Oval Office that day of that relationship and President Trump's efforts to find a way to repair it, I would imagine that's something that Putin was not happy to see, that they reconciled, that they met at the Vatican, of all places, because Putin would like to see a wedge between Zelensky and Trump, and, you know, continue to find a way back to Trump and let them find some sort of resolution here. So that dynamic has been really fascinating to watch, Brett.
Yeah, it really has. Well, we're going to see you in about 40 minutes
Thank you
on the 5. Thanks for being here. Fox News Chief International Correspondent Steve Harrigan has covered the war in Ukraine. He has spent more than a decade as a Moscow correspondent. He speaks Russian, so he has a unique insight here. He joins us now. Steve, good afternoon. Your thoughts on this day?
Brett, this is just riveting, and when the two of you talk about hope, I think it's hope really around the world. So much hope and a lot of pageantry, but you know, I don't want to be a buzzkill, but I can't get away from who President Trump is dealing with and who President Trump really got to the table, and that's Vladimir Putin. I remember the first time coming out of Ukraine after the war had started. It's a long drive to get out, and you have to go out through Poland, and there's a lot of shoving and pushing in the airport, and behind me, you know, I was wondering who was shoving. It was children who had lost limbs in the war, and they were getting to the front of the line to get on the flight. You know, and I felt bad about being irritated. And even covering the war inside Ukraine, it wasn't like other wars. There wasn't a front line and a back line because the Russian side would hit anywhere. There was targeting of civilians. So handshakes, nice ties, red carpets, but one of these guys is killing civilians. And I think we have to keep that in mind here. One of these guys doesn't believe Ukraine is a country. And if you're going to ask one question to Putin, ask him, is Ukraine a country? And do you think somehow you're going to be able to take over and rule 40 million people who don't want you to?
You make great points, Steve, and I remember you, who are such a seasoned war correspondent, saying, I have never seen anything like what is happening in Ukraine. And I'm glad that you bring that up today as we watch the effort to bring some sort of peace to those people and hopefully let them find their way home. But there are so many barriers to that, as you point out. Tell us what your sense is of whether or not Russia is winning at this point, because we hear they've made some strides recently, but General Jack Keane said don't overestimate that.
Sure, I think the general is absolutely right. You can't talk about a force that is losing 1,000 people a day, 1,000 casualties, dead and wounded every day for the past 3 years, 1 million casualties in Russia. You can't call that a victory, but there have been very slow incremental gains on the ground, taking territory, and perhaps that's given Putin some confidence that he can keep going. But Martha, you know, you talked about this. To call this any kind of a victory is crazy, but Russia has learned over 3 years of war. We saw the blatant incompetence at the start of the war. Russian tanks being blown up, running out of fuel. They have learned. They are doing better on the battlefield. They have better tactics. They're not just getting recruits out of jails anymore. They're giving them $30,000 to sign up. So they've learned. They're making their own drones. They're doing things differently. If you get blown up, your family might get $200,000, which is a lot of money in some parts of Russia. So Russia has learned. Russia is making some success on the battlefield. They haven't taken a major city. And how long can you lose 1,000 soldiers a day? 5 Vietnams in Russia in the past 3 years. You don't see a lot of protests on the streets. It's because people are afraid. This is a totalitarian government that controls the media. People are living in fear, and it's a one-man show. This is a major war based on one man's idea, that Ukraine is not a country, that it's part of Russia. One man has to be stopped. One man has to be brought to the table and have his options limited.
That's interesting, and you know, I hear it from the Ukrainians a lot, Steve, and that is, you know, they see this image of smiling and handshakes and slapping backs, and they look at someone who they describe and is accurately a war criminal in the eyes of the International Criminal Court, the ICC. The U.S. obviously doesn't adhere to that overall, but one of the reasons they can't go to Rome is because Vladimir Putin could get arrested there at the headquarters of the ICC. You know, you talk about succeeding on the battlefield. They're having incremental success, but you were there at the beginning when they got stuck, essentially. Whole columns of tanks really taken out by javelins provided by the U.S., yet they are having incremental success in some places.
They are. They've changed their tactics. They're on a war footing. Their economy is on a war footing. They're doing things differently now, so they are making some gains. And also, keep in mind, you know, Russia has 140 million people. They outnumber Ukraine on the battlefield 4-1, so they do have some real advantages in this fight.
Steve, one of the things that I just want to also touch on here, and I know you've talked about this, these reports of 20,000 children who have been taken into Ukraine. You know, this is one of the issues that is expected to potentially come up today. You know, in a larger sense, what does Putin want? What is he from this whole summit? What is he willing to potentially give?
Yeah, it's certainly one of the most emotional and thorniest questions, and really one of the strangest as well, to try and take people away. This whole idea, if you ask Putin if Ukraine is a country, he'll probably sit down and tell you for 2 hours why it's not, why it's all part of Mother Russia. But you know, props to President Trump for getting him to the table. And earlier, Brett, you mentioned him talking to Lukashenko, the dictator of Belarus, on the phone. Over and over again, you hear from the Trump administration, reality. We're dealing with the reality on the ground. They're dealing with the dictator in Belarus. They're dealing with Putin, who bombs civilians. They're bringing him to the table to try and save lives. That's the goal here. He's dealing with the reality on the ground to try and make something happen.
Yeah, and I think President Trump has always said, you know, if you want to negotiate with someone, you have to sort of, you know, you've got to create a little bit of a warm atmosphere to at least begin the conversation, and that's what we saw on the tarmac. But Steve, thank you for reminding us of all of the underbelly of how brutal this war has been. But we are at the table right now, and we hope that they get somewhere. Thank you so much, Steve Harrigan.
Thank you. Yeah, Steve, thank you very much. Let's bring in Dan Hoffman, former CIA station chief. He served in Russia, now Fox News contributor. Dan, great to see you. You know, we've been talking a little bit about the psyche of Vladimir Putin and what this behind the scenes, it's no longer a one-on-one, it's essentially a couple of others in the room, but what this may look like, and you have a kind of unique insight into Putin from years of experience.
Yeah, I spent decades at CIA trying to see the world through the twisted eyes of Vladimir Putin, and what I can tell you is that he's got an incredibly high threshold for pain, but for his own countrymen, he has destroyed Ukraine and targeted Ukrainian civilians ruthlessly. But as Steve noted, 1 million injured or killed Russian soldiers. That's an incredible amount. Russia's on their knees begging for help from North Korea, cannon fodder, North Korean soldiers fighting on Russia's behalf, Iran providing drones, and Russia on their knees to China, exporting their hydrocarbons and keeping their economy as weak as it is afloat. And that's not a good look for Russia, and the ones who see that most closely are Russia, or Putin's own inner circle, his national security officials, intelligence officers. That's why the CIA has mounted a full court press over the past few years with those videos, recruiting Russians, high-level sources who can tell us about Putin's plans and intentions. Dictatorships are brittle, and Vladimir Putin probably knows better than anybody the cost that he has forced Russia to bear for this loser war that has resulted in Europe being awakened from their Cold War slumber, paying for their own defense, and engaged in that endeavor. Finland and Sweden, now NATO members. The question is, past his prologue, Putin isn't interested in making a deal. But maybe he's reached a tipping point. President Trump is giving Putin one last best chance. And I would emphasize it's not just Putin listening, it's his senior officials as well to this opportunity.
Yeah, you make great points. NATO has never been larger, and they have never spent more money than they're spending right now as a result of the negotiations that President Trump has been able to put forward. I'm curious what you think about the Russian people as they watch all this, because they get a filtered view of what's going on, but how strong is his support at home? We know their elections are not like ours, but what's your sense?
Well, I think Steve's right that Vladimir Putin does not allow freedom of expression or freedom of assembly in Russia. He also doesn't have a Politburo like the Soviets did, where you had a bunch of, albeit old, geriatric guys getting together to talk about domestic and foreign policy and making decisions, even though there was one general secretary and, of course, in Stalin's time, one dictator. But that wasn't always the case. In this case, with Putin, it's the vertikalnaya vlast, the vertical of power, where Putin himself is responsible for so many decisions and has made so many intelligence failures, ironic as that might be, given his KGB past. So, look, I think the challenge that we face is that Vladimir Putin alone is responsible for this war, but he's in the room with President Trump right now, and that offers an opportunity potentially to resolve it, though I feel like we're closer to the beginning of this than the end.
Really quickly, Dan, just talk for a second about the psyops of the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, showing up here in Alaska with a CCCP sweatshirt, which is essentially the Soviet Union, the USSR, walking into the hotel knowing that the reporters were going to see him, just about the whole thing of wearing that sweatshirt.
Yeah, probably a play to Vladimir Putin, who said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the worst geopolitical catastrophe of the previous century. But hey, things didn't turn out too well for the Soviet Union. It's kind of the joke's on Lavrov, I think, in this case.
Dan, thank you.
We appreciate the time.
Good to have you with us.
Take a quick break, and we will be right back after this with continuing coverage of the Trump-Putin summit here in Alaska.